There was a reason why 11 of the richest households in Ashland County, Tennessee, abandoned their family surnames between 1848 and 1860. 11 dynasties had steered the county's courts, banks, and fertile farmland for more than 2 decades suddenly wanted to erase the very identities that had built their power. They scattered across 5 states, some traveling as far as Arkansas and Kansas, desperate to distance themselves from something that had taken place in the late autumn of 1848. And what they were fleeing wasn't disease, nor war, nor financial ruin. It was a woman. Her name was Marina Caldwell, and she had been born with 1 emerald green eye and 1 deep hazel eye, a condition so rare that people in 1825 believed it meant she saw what others were blind to. But what destroyed those 11 households had nothing to do with superstition. It had everything to do with what Marina had quietly observed for 23 years. What she came to understand about how influence worked in Tennessee, and what she did with that understanding when the chance finally came. They later called it a curse. The local papers called it the Ashland Affair. Before we go any further into how one woman unraveled some of the most powerful men in central Tennessee, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. And if you want more dark stories from American history, stories that sound impossible but were very real, subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what comes next. What makes this story truly unsettling isn't that Marina Caldwell possessed some supernatural ability. It's that she had something none of these men expected an enslaved woman to possess: access to their secrets, the intelligence to understand what those secrets meant, and eventually the opportunity to speak. Ashland County, Tennessee, in 1825 was a land of contradictions. Tobacco fields stretched wide and profitable beneath the summer sun, while the Elk River curved through valleys once home to Chickasaw families who had been pushed west. The county seat, Ashland Springs, had grown wealthy on forced labor, its courthouse and merchant homes whispering of prosperity built on suffering that polite society refused to examine. The earth was rich, the seasons generous, and by the 1820s Ashland County had become one of the most prosperous agricultural regions in central Tennessee. Tobacco ruled, cotton rising behind it, and the men who owned the soil owned everything else: the banks, the courts, the elections, even the stories the county told about itself. The Caldwell estate covered nearly 900 acres of prime bottomland. It was managed by Captain Nathaniel Caldwell, a man whose reputation teetered between honorable gentleman and something far darker, something murmured about only in the slave quarters after nightfall. Caldwell had inherited the land from his father in 1820 and spent the next several years expanding both his acreage and his political reach. He served as a magistrate, dined with Tennessee's elite, and hosted private gatherings where agreements were made that never found their way into public ledgers. By regional standards, the plantation was impressive. The main house stood 2 stories high, made of brick and cedar, its broad porch catching every evening breeze. Behind it stretched the true engine of the estate: tobacco barns, smokehouses, a blacksmith shop, a loom shed, and 2 long rows of cabins where the enslaved population lived. 79 people labored on Caldwell land in 1825, their work feeding the wealth that flowed into the big house and out into the merchant circles of Ashland Springs. On a brisk morning in March 1825, a child was born in one of the cabin rows. The midwife, an elderly woman named Agatha, who had delivered babies of both the enslaved and the free for decades, had seen nearly everything in her 70-plus years: breech births, twins, tragedies, miracles, children who arrived screaming, and children who arrived with the silence of frost. But she had never seen eyes like the one staring up at her from the infant girl she wrapped in cloth. One eye was a shimmering green, bright as spring leaves after rain. The other was a warm, deep hazel that almost appeared black under the lamplight. The condition had a scientific name: heterochromia iridum, though few in Ashland County would have known it. What they knew were the legends, the warnings, the old whispers that such a mark meant something. Agatha hesitated before speaking. "Baby's got 2 different eyes," she said quietly, her voice steady but thoughtful. "Seen it one time before." Child grew up strong. Nothing wrong with her, just marked. But the baby's mother, Lena, saw the small tremor in Agatha's hands as she swaddled the infant. She caught the fleeting, nervous glance toward the door, the instinctive check to ensure no one else was listening. Lena was 25, had survived the Middle Passage as a young girl, and had learned to read danger the way others read scripture. She knew fear when she saw it, even in small, practiced gestures. Holding her daughter close, Lena made a decision that would shape the decades ahead. She named her Marina, a name she'd once heard in the mistress's readings, a name that carried strength, and she vowed to raise her as if nothing were unusual, even though she knew the whispers would come. For the first 6 years of Marina's life, that plan worked well enough. The children in the quarters accepted her easily. Curious at first, but soon indifferent once the novelty faded. They played together, ate together, and learned the quiet rules of survival that governed enslaved life. White children, however, kept their distance, warned by parents who spun tales about mismatched eyes bringing misfortune or allowing someone to see spirits. But Marina was developing traits that had nothing to do with superstition. She possessed a memory that bordered on frightening. She could hear a story once and repeat it perfectly. She remembered faces, connections, and conversations years old with absolute precision. She spotted patterns adults missed entirely. Her mother noticed it first. By the age of 4, Marina could repeat entire songs after hearing them a single time. By 5, she could describe in perfect detail events that had taken place 2 years earlier, remembering not only what happened, but who was there, what they were wearing, and even what the sky looked like that day. By 6, she had begun to understand that her gift set her apart in ways far beyond her mismatched eyes. And as she grew older, that gift evolved into something far more formidable. The summer of 1830 brought a drought that turned Ashland County bitter and brittle. The tobacco crops brown in the fields, leaves curling like dead paper, and tempers snapped under the relentless heat. The Elk River dropped so low that rocks appeared where no one living had ever seen them. Crops failed. The enslaved were pushed to exhaustion, forced to haul water from distant wells while the sun scorched the fields without mercy. Marina had just turned 6 when she was assigned to work inside the main house under the supervision of Eunice, the head housekeeper who had served the Caldwell family for more than 3 decades. Eunice was a woman carved from quiet strength, respected by the enslaved community and tolerated by the white family she served. She had mastered the impossible art of surviving plantation life, knowing when silence protected her, when a gentle push could influence outcomes, and when submission was the only path to survival. It was Eunice who first realized what truly set Marina apart, not the different colored eyes. Their novelty had long faded, but her mind. The child absorbed instructions instantly, performing tasks days later with flawless precision. She remembered which guests had visited weeks before, what dishes they'd been served, and the exact conversations they'd held as she quietly cleared the table. She knew the location of every dish, every utensil, every linen. She could recount the weekly menu after hearing the cook murmur it once on a Monday morning. She remembered names of people she had met only briefly, months earlier. Eunice watched all of this with growing unease. She had seen enough to know that intelligence in enslaved people was both coveted and feared, a tool to be exploited, yet a threat to be crushed. A child who understood too much, who noticed what was never meant to be noticed, was a child at risk. One sticky July evening, after the household had gone still, Eunice slipped through the shadows toward Lena's cabin. They spoke in whispers, their voices woven into the hum of cicadas. "That girl remembers everything," Eunice murmured, urgency creeping into her tone. "I've watched her. She hears something once, and it stays with her forever." Today she repeated a conversation to Miss Caldwell from 2 weeks ago, word for word. If the wrong person notices that, Lena felt her chest tighten, the same fear she had carried since the day Marina was born. "What you think I'm supposed to do?" she whispered. "Teach her to misplace things," Eunice said. "Teach her to ask twice even when she already knows the answer. Teach her to look unsure when she understands perfectly." She has to seem ordinary. If she doesn't, she's going to draw eyes she doesn't want. Lena understood instantly. Plantation life depended on a lie that enslaved people were less intelligent, less capable, less human. Anyone who challenged that illusion, even unintentionally, risked punishment, separation, or death. So Lena began teaching Marina the painful art of hiding her brilliance, pretending confusion, acting forgetful, lowering her gaze even when she understood everything. It broke Lena's heart, but she knew it might save her daughter's life. Still, there were some truths that could not be disguised and moments that could not be forgotten once witnessed. One suffocating August night, when the heat hung over the plantation like a heavy blanket, Captain Caldwell hosted a dinner for 10 of his closest allies. They arrived in sleek carriages, dust rising behind them like smoke trails. They were men of deep influence, plantation owners from surrounding counties, a state representative whose district covered Ashland, 2 circuit judges, several wealthy merchants whose loans kept the tobacco economy alive, and a land investor named Jared Wickham, whose fortune came from dealings never openly discussed. The dining room glittered under candlelight. Eunice had arranged a fine china precisely. The silverware shined to brilliance, the white linen smooth without a wrinkle. The food was rich for rural Tennessee. Roasted meats, seasoned vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, preserves, puddings, and apple pies crafted from the last of last year's dried fruit. Marina, small enough to pass unnoticed, drifted between the guests, refilling glasses and clearing dishes. Eunice had placed her there intentionally, hoping the girl would simply become invisible among the murmurs and candle flames. But the men were deep into their bourbon, and with drink came loosened tongues, lowered guards, and truths that were never meant to be spoken in front of anyone, especially not a child like her. Marina heard Jared Wickham boasting about recent acquisition, his words slurred with pride. "Snatched the Denton farm for a quarter of its worth," he said smugly. "Widow never realized her husband put the deed up as collateral years ago. I happened to come across the papers. Through the right channels. By the time she understood what happened, foreclosure was done. Couldn't have crafted it better myself." Then she heard Judge Redfield chuckle, a cold, humorless sound, as he described dismissing a case brought by a free black man named Jonah, who was fighting to reclaim his 3 children. The children had been sold before Jonah's manumission was finalized, and he'd spent 2 years scraping together enough money to buy them back, only to discover they'd been sold into 3 different counties. Couldn't allow that kind of thing to set a precedent, Judge Redfield said, swirling his drink. If he'd won, every one of them would be swarming the courts with similar demands. Order has to be maintained. Structure has to hold. I threw it out on a technicality, improper paperwork. And naturally, he couldn't afford representation. Made it easy. The others nodded. The men nodded approvingly, fully aware of what their choices meant. The law, to them, was not a tool for justice, but an instrument for preserving a hierarchy that benefited only those sitting at the table. Marina listened as Captain Caldwell laid out a plan to pressure the county assessor into undervaluing several riverfront properties along the Elk River bottomlands. Under the scheme, the men would quietly coordinate lowball offers, fabricate debts, and orchestrate discreet foreclosures that would let their consortium absorb vast stretches of fertile land from small, struggling farmers. But then Marina heard something that made her pause mid-step, her fingers tightening around the heavy water pitcher. Her pulse hammered in her ears. They were discussing a woman named Clara Thomaston, a free woman of color who owned nearly 40 acres of rich farmland just outside Ashland Springs. Clara had inherited the property from her white father, a respected trader who had freed Clara's mother and their children his will, granting them both liberty and land that should have secured their future. Clara had refused every offer to sell. She ran a thriving small farm, producing vegetables, eggs, and poultry that were sought after in town for their quality. She followed every law scrupulously, paid her taxes on time, and kept her freedom papers in flawless order. The men at the table began to speculate, almost casually, about what might happen if doubts suddenly appear concerning the legitimacy of her father's will. Doubts that Martin Kelliher, a lawyer known for manipulating property disputes, believed he could uncover, or if an inspection of Clara's freedom papers revealed inconsistencies that Judge Redfield might feel obligated to address, or if new debts or liens were discovered, debts that Jared Whitcomb claimed he might have documentation for, if the timing was right. These kind of things tend to work themselves out, Captain Caldwell said, his tone as calm as if discussing crop rotation rather than a human life. Apply the right pressure in the right places. She will either sell in time, or circumstances will create alternatives. The woman has no family backing her, no attorney she can afford, no shield of influence. It's just a matter of coordination. The others murmured in agreement, already drifting back into discussions of other schemes, other opportunities for profit. Marina stood frozen, the picture still clutched against her chest, staring at the men whose decisions shaped life and death, fortune and ruin across Ashland County. Though only 6 years old, she understood with terrifying clarity what she was hearing. These men were mapping out the destruction of Clara Thomaston, planning to strip her of everything she'd earned simply because they wanted her land, and because they possessed the power to do it. 2 months later, on a cold October night, Clara's farmhouse went up in flames. Neighbors said the fire burned so quickly, so fiercely, that it seemed almost unnatural. Clara perished inside, trapped before anyone could reach her. Within 3 weeks, her land was ordered to be sold at auction to pay outstanding debts that appeared in court records with suspicious efficiency. The paperwork was filed by attorney Martin Kelliher and approved without hesitation by Judge Redfield. Jared Whitcomb then purchased the property for less than half its value. The Ashland Springs Gazette printed a brief notice expressing sympathy, a tragic accident, the paper called it. No mention of timing, no mention of motives, no mention of the dinner table where her fate had been quietly sealed. Marina was 6 years old, but she remembered everything. She remembered every voice, every name, every glint of satisfaction in the eyes of men who believed themselves untouchable. She remembered Judge Redfield's cold laugh, Whitcomb's greedy delight, and Captain Caldwell's smooth assurance that these things resolved themselves. She remembered Martin Kelliher's calculating expression, the way he had already begun imagining the legal pathways he would manipulate. And that night marked the beginning of an understanding that would define the next 17 years of her life, an understanding that would ultimately bring down 11 families and reshape the balance of power in Tennessee. Power was not only measured in land, money, or law. Power was information. Power was leverage. Power was remembering what others forgot or were forced to forget. Power was witnessing what the powerful believed could never be witnessed. At 6 years old, Marina Caldwell had become an accidental archive of corruption. She didn't yet know how she would use that knowledge or when, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. One day, it would matter. One day, these men would regret ever letting her hear them speak. One day, she would bring fire, not the kind that consumed Clara Thomaston's home, but something more devastating. The truth. Sombras du Pasado. From 1830 to 1838, Marina grew from a child into a young woman, and her memory became something that made people quietly uneasy. Life on the plantation moved in predictable cycles: spring planting, summer tending, autumn curing, winter scarcity. Crops grew or failed. Babies were born. People disappeared. And beneath it all pulsed the constant threat of violence that maintained the entire system. Eunice, the head housekeeper who had first recognized Marina's extraordinary mind, fell ill during the brutal winter of 1833. A sudden cold snap froze the Elk River for days, and the chills seeped into her lungs. Despite her decades of loyalty, she received only basic medical care. She died before the spring thaw, buried in the small graveyard behind the cabins, marked only by a wooden cross that the seasons would devour within a few years. Before she died, Eunice asked Marina to come to her side. Marina was 9 then, already working long days inside the house, already learning to read danger like scripture. "You got a gift," Eunice whispered, each breath a struggle. "But a gift can turn into a curse if you don't handle it carefully. You remember everything, but you must learn when to speak and when to swallow your words. Some truths will kill you if you reveal them too soon. Some you have to carry, watch, wait, and release only when the moment is right. Do you understand?" Marina nodded, clutching the old woman's cold fingers. "Promise me you'll use your mind wisely," Eunice whispered. "Wise enough to stay alive long enough to claim your freedom. Don't let them break you. And don't let that memory of yours be the thing that gets you buried." Those were the last words they ever shared. Eunice died that night, taking decades of hard-earned wisdom with her. Lena did everything she could to keep her daughter hidden behind a mask of ordinary obedience. But Marina's uncommon eyes made invisibility impossible. The plantation owners and merchants who visited the Caldwell estate took note of the quiet, sharp-eyed girl who moved silently through the parlor, remembering everything without effort. Some were unnerved by her stare, murmuring old folk tales about mixed eyes and second sight, crossing themselves when she passed. Others treated her like a curiosity, an oddity to remark upon, a useful servant who never needed to be told anything twice. By 1835, Captain Caldwell had begun placing Marina intentionally in rooms where important conversations were held. Through subtle tests, he discovered that she could repeat statements made weeks earlier, word for word. At first, it entertained him, a private trick he performed for guests. He would say, "Marina, what did Judge Redfield say about the Carter estate dispute 14 days ago?" And calmly, she would recite the conversation exactly, his phrasing, his predictions, even the legal loopholes he referenced. Guests would marvel, whisper theories, wonder aloud whether her unusual eyes were the source of her uncanny recall. Captain Caldwell accepted their praise, laughing about how convenient it was to have a living ledger on his staff. What he never realized was that Marina had begun building her own silent record, a mental archive of every scheme, every fraud, every betrayal that passed through those rooms. She knew which debts were legitimate and which were fabricated to justify taking land. She knew which court rulings had been decided long before they were ever brought to the courthouse. She knew which wills were rewritten under pressure, which marriages were arranged to consolidate acreage, which signatures had been forged, and which testimonies had been bought. And she knew something far more dangerous: the interlocking network of alliances among the 11 powerful men who regularly met at the Caldwell estate, a web of influence and corruption so tightly woven that it allowed them to control Ashland County with complete ease. They called themselves, in private jokes and drunken toasts, the Ashland Circle. But there was no official record of such an organization, no documents, no charter, nothing written anywhere. Just men who understood that cooperating in secret multiplied their individual power. There was Captain Nathaniel Caldwell, the host and facilitator, whose estate offered a neutral meeting ground and whose title as county magistrate allowed him to steer legal processes. There was Judge Elias Redfield, who oversaw the circuit court for Ashland County and 3 neighboring regions, ensuring that any legal threats to Circle interests were dismissed or quietly redirected. There was Jared Whitcomb, the land speculator, who profited from buying distressed properties, distress that was often manufactured through the Circle's manipulations. There was Richard Callum, who owned 280 acres and nearly 50 enslaved laborers north of Ashland Springs, whose political ties in Nashville warned the group about legislation that might affect future profits. There was Samuel Proctor, who ran the county's most profitable cotton ginning operation, controlling prices and payment schedules in ways that kept small farmers permanently indebted. There was Walter Hensley, head of the county land office, gatekeeper of every deed, survey, and title. He could identify vulnerable landholders with one glance and adjust documents when needed. There was Thomas Wells, owner of the main mercantile in town, whose credit system trapped farmers in debt cycles long before their crops ever sprouted. There was Grant Cumber, president of the county's only bank, whose loan approvals or denials could determine the fate of entire families. There was Henry Lohman, owner of the largest tobacco warehouse in the region, whose control over grading and sale prices meant he could make or break a farmer's yearly income. There was Senator Reed Ashford, representing the county in the state legislature, feeding the circle early updates about political movements, land taxes, and regulatory shifts. There was Martin Kellier, the lawyer whose specialty was property disputes, inheritance battles, and contract law, capable of creating legal barriers or dissolving them, depending on who paid him. And there was Abner Trask, manager of the Ashland slave market, who handled the buying and selling of human beings and coordinated prices with the circle to suppress competition. Together, these 11 men controlled almost every aspect of the county's economy and legal system. They enriched one another through information sharing, orchestrated pressure, and a web of strategic decisions that made them untouchable. They ruined anyone who threatened their interests through paperwork, court rulings, quiet threats, or, when necessary, violence carried out by men who could never be traced back to them. All the while, they maintained reputations as gentlemen, church deacons, charitable donors, respected fathers who talked endlessly about morality, tradition, order, and honor. And Marina knew everything about them, not because she wanted to, but because she had heard them plan, boast, and refine their methods in her presence, believing she was nothing more than furniture that breathed. They spoke freely because they believed the enslaved people standing in the room were no more capable of true memory or understanding than the tables they polished or the dishes they carried. To them, servants were fixtures, not witnesses, bodies without minds. But in 1838, something shifted in Captain Caldwell's use of Marina's abilities. Whether it came from arrogance, curiosity, or a growing sense that he could exploit her talent without consequence, he began questioning her more directly about what she'd heard. At first, the questions were simple, confirmations of things he already knew, but soon they evolved into something else. He wanted Marina to repeat, word for word, what Richard Callum had said about a boundary dispute with a neighbor, so he could determine whether Callum's public statements matched his private intentions. He wanted to know the exact number Thomas Wells had claimed to lend a particular farmer, because the figures Wells presented to the circle didn't align with his drunken comments. He wanted to hear which parcels of land Jared Whitcomb had expressed interest in acquiring, so he could buy them first, or force Whitcomb into a more favorable partnership. In other words, Captain Caldwell had begun using Marina's memory as a weapon against his own allies. The circle was built on mutual benefit, but Caldwell had begun to see opportunities to benefit slightly more than the others, to make himself the indispensable center of their operations. He wanted to become the one man the others couldn't afford to cross. And Marina recognized something vital. Her memory, once merely a dangerous burden, had become a form of power. Information was leverage. Leverage could become strategy. And strategy, someday, could become freedom. Freedom was a word enslaved people carried only inside themselves, hidden deep where no overseer could touch it. But Marina began to imagine a path toward it, a faint, distant shape she could not yet name, built from secrets and quiet observation and patience sharpened over years. What she didn't yet understand was how steep that path would be, or how many would fall along it, including the families of the 11 men who believed themselves untouchable, and generations of descendants who would inherit only scandal and shame. Because when you stand at the very bottom of a system designed to keep you there forever, the only escape often requires burning the entire system down. And Marina Caldwell, though she could not have explained it at 14, was beginning to sense that destruction would eventually be necessary. 1841 marked the beginning of the unraveling, though no one recognized it then. Captain Caldwell's health had begun to fail. A deep, persistent cough plagued him through the winter, what the county doctor blamed on years of breathing tobacco dust in the humid Tennessee heat. By spring, the truth was clear. Caldwell's reign over plantation and over the Ashland Circle was ending. His son, Nathan Caldwell Jr., returned from Nashville, where he had been studying law for 3 years, preparing to take over the state. He was 26, ambitious and sharp-tongued. But he lacked his father's restraint, his patience, his ability to maintain delicate alliances. Marina, now 17, watched him with careful attention. She had spent her entire life studying men, their gestures, their lies, their ego, the small cracks in their armor when they thought no one important was observing. Nathan Jr. wanted desperately to prove himself worthy of inheritance, not only of land, but of influence. That desperation made him reckless. He began hosting meetings more frequently, trying to claim his father's role as coordinator. Members of the circle attended with mixed reactions. Some, like Judge Redfield and Wickham, welcomed him, eager for continuity. Others, like Callum and banker Grant Cumber, doubted his maturity, uncertain whether someone so inexperienced could maintain the careful balance that had kept their alliance profitable and discreet for nearly 2 decades. For Marina, this meant more conversations to overhear, more secrets to collect, more evidence to store in the flawless archive of her mind. It also meant something far more dangerous. Nathan Jr. had started discussing her. The turning point came in the plantation office on a bitter February night in 1843. Nathan Jr. had invited Whitcomb and attorney Martin Kellier to strategize future expansions. Upstairs, Captain Caldwell lay bedridden, his lungs rattling with each breath, his authority evaporating. "The girl's memory is extraordinary," Nathan Jr. said, motioning toward Marina as she stood silently by the wall, pretending to wait for instructions. "Better than any logbook. Nothing to record. Nothing to hide. Nothing to burn if someone starts asking the wrong questions. I've been considering leasing her out, letting other members use her for transactions we can't afford to write down." Wickham, older and far more seasoned, narrowed his eyes. "You're talking about letting a slave understand she has value beyond her hands. Dangerous ground, Nathan. Your father knew better. He exploited her, sure, but he never let her see her own worth, never let her think she had leverage." Kellier, who had forged more legal documents than he would ever admit, stared at Marina with unsettling clarity. "She already knows," he said quietly. "Look at her eyes. She's absorbing every word of this conversation. She's been absorbing everything for years. The question isn't whether she understands her value. The question is what she plans to do with it." Nathan Jr. laughed, a brittle sound, more bluster than confidence. "She's property. Understanding doesn't matter. She can know she's valuable. She can know every secret we have. But what can she do? Who would believe her? Who would let her speak? The system protects us." But Marina had already extracted something crucial from that exchange, something Martin Kellier had revealed without meaning to. The Ashland Circle feared paper. Written evidence terrified them. For nearly 20 years, they had been scrupulous about keeping their most dangerous dealings off the books. Nothing incriminating appeared in county ledgers. No signatures tied them to their schemes. Agreements were verbal, private, unrecorded, impossible to subpoena, impossible to prove. What the men never realized was that Marina had become the very thing they feared most, a living archive of everything they had tried so hard not to write down. Every falsified deed, every rigged foreclosure, every prearranged court ruling, every ruined farmer, destroyed family, stolen legacy. All of it stored with flawless clarity inside the mind of a young woman they believed too powerless to use it. Over the next 2 years, as Captain Caldwell slowly declined and Nathan Jr. assumed command, Marina's position changed in ways that increased both her access and her risk. Against the warnings of older circle members, Nathan Jr. used her more openly than his father ever had. She poured drinks while they discussed plans. She polished furniture while they coordinated fraud. She stood in corners, seemingly forgotten, as secrets spilled into the air around her, and she heard everything. She heard Samuel Proctor, owner of the cotton gin, explain how he cheated farmers by using tampered scales and interpretive bookkeeping, skimming profit he had no right to. He knew they had no competing gin within 20 miles. He knew geography trapped them. Debt trapped them. He stole from them because he could, and because the circle protected him. She heard Grant Cumber, the banker, outline how he structured loans to guarantee foreclosure, impossible repayment schedules, crushing interest, clauses that allowed him to call debts due whenever convenient. He spoke of it proudly, like a craftsman describing his finest work. She heard Senator Reed Ashford brag about destroying a political rival by planting rumors of financial misconduct and immoral behavior through multiple trusted sources. The lies were seamless, timed perfectly, and devastating. The rival withdrew. His reputation never recovered. She heard about Captain Caldwell's daughter, renamed here as Caroline Harwell Mercer, who had married a Methodist minister in defiance of her father in 1836 and been cut off financially. Living in Nashville, raising 3 children on a meager preacher's salary, she filed a legal challenge to contest her father's final will, claiming he'd been mentally unsound when he rewrote it to give everything to Nathan Jr. The Ashland Circle could not let her win. Attorney Kellier handled the strategy, filing motions questioning her motives and her legal standing. Judge Redfield made sure the case landed in his own courtroom rather than in the hands of a neutral circuit judge. 7 men were coached and compensated to testify under oath that Captain Caldwell had been perfectly lucid before his death in early 1843. The hearing lasted a single day. Caroline's young attorney, underfunded, outmaneuvered, idealistic, never stood a chance. Redfield's ruling cited legal precedents that were legitimate but chosen with surgical precision to support the circle's predetermined outcome. The will stood. Nathan Jr. inherited property and assets worth nearly $50,000, a fortune equivalent to more than $1 million in later valuation. Caroline Harwell Mercer died in Nashville in 1852, poor, resentful, and fully aware she'd been robbed, yet powerless to prove it. Marina knew every detail of how the circle had orchestrated Caroline's defeat. She knew which witnesses had been bribed. She knew what favors Judge Redfield had been promised. She knew how the arguments had been rehearsed weeks before the case was ever presented. But something else had begun to form in her mind, something the men themselves seemed blind to. Their interdependence, their unity, their mutual loyalty was their greatest vulnerability. Every man's crimes were tied to another's. Whitcomb's fraudulent land deals were legalized through Kellier's documents and upheld by Judge Redfield, using records accessed through Walter Hensley. Cumber's predatory loans were secured by crop sales manipulated through Henry Loman's warehouse and processed through Proctor's Gin. Senator Ashford could influence legislation only because the circle financed his campaigns. Pull one thread, and the entire web became visible. Destroy one man's credibility, and contagion would spread to all 11. Their system worked flawlessly only as long as no one examined it closely. In 1844, Marina was 20 years old. Legally, she was considered property valued at roughly $900, based on age, health, and skills. But in truth, she possessed knowledge that could annihilate a dozen of the most influential men in central Tennessee. She knew exact figures, exact dates, exact quotes, exact deals, exact lies. She knew metaphorical bodies buried, and in at least 2 cases, literal ones. The question was no longer what she knew. It was whether using that knowledge would cost her life. In the spring of 1844, Nathan Caldwell Jr. made a catastrophic decision that accelerated everything. He was approached by a cotton speculator from Memphis with a proposal to invest heavily in cotton futures, essentially betting on predicted price spikes caused by reported crop failures in Georgia and South Carolina. The speculator appeared legitimate. Polished credentials, convincing documentation, and claims of insider information from Charleston brokers. Nathan Jr. invested $8,000 of plantation funds. He also persuaded 3 other circle members to join him. $5,000, $3,000, $4,000. Those were the contributions made by Richard Callum, Samuel Proctor, and Jared Whitcomb. Altogether, the total investment reached $20,000, a massive sum even for men of their stature. the equivalent of more than a decade of steady profit from a mid-sized estate. The scheme collapsed in August. Reports of crop failures in Georgia and South Carolina were revealed to have been exaggerated and likely invented by the Memphis speculator who vanished after collecting funds from multiple investors. Warrants were issued, but the man disappeared somewhere between Natchez and the Mississippi River. He was never found. The money was gone, all $20,000. The financial loss was painful, but the deeper wound came for what the failure exposed. Nathan Caldwell Jr. was not the leader his father had been. Richard Callum, who lost the most, was enraged. He had trusted Nathan Jr. solely because of the Caldwell name, assuming the opportunity had been vetted with the same discipline and caution the elder Caldwell would have exercised. The Ashland Circle, united for nearly 2 decades, began to crack. Meetings became strained. Voices rose. Accusations flowed. Under Captain Caldwell's stewardship, such discord would have been unthinkable. Samuel Proctor demanded immediate reimbursement from plantation funds. Jared Wickham suggested that Nathan Jr. sell sections of the estate to repay the losses, and Richard Callum began hinting, not subtly, that certain cooperative arrangements might become public knowledge unless he was compensated. Marina observed quietly from the edges of the room, seeing more clearly than ever that crisis breeds opportunities. The circle was fracturing. Self-interest was drowning loyalty. And Nathan Jr., desperate and cornered, made the choice that would ultimately doom them all. He decided to sell her. The decision came in October 1844, after a particularly ugly meeting at the Caldwell estate. Callum had openly questioned whether Nathan Jr. was fit to inherit his father's role, or even to manage a plantation of his size. The message beneath the words was unmistakable. If you cannot control your finances, how can we trust you to protect us? Nathan Jr. needed money immediately, but he also needed to eliminate a danger that attorney Martin Kellier had pointed out months earlier. Marina knew too much. She had been present for too many conversations, heard too many crimes, remembered too many details. As long as she remained in Ashland County, she was a living liability. So he chose the one solution that erased the problem and generated money at the same time. He would sell her south, far from anyone who knew her unusual eyes or her extraordinary memory, into a massive operation where she would vanish into the anonymity of hundreds of enslaved workers. Nathan Jr. contacted a trader named William Hatcher, who transported enslaved people between Nashville and Natchez. Hatcher agreed to move Marina quietly as part of a coffle set to depart in July 1845. The price, $950, above her assessed value, because Hatcher understood the sale required discretion. No auction, no public listing, no questions. Marina learned about her impending sale in November. She overheard Nathan Jr. discussing it with Thomas Wells, explaining how it removed a threat and restored control. The sale was 8 months away. That gave her 8 months to do the impossible. Find a way to secure her freedom. No money, no rights, no allies, no path recognized under Tennessee law. Most people would have collapsed under the certainty of doom. But Marina had spent 20 years watching powerful men bend systems, exploit weaknesses, and perform miracles of deception through planning and leverage. So she began planning her own miracle. Step 1. Learn to write. She had taught herself to read over the years, simply by being near papers, ledgers, and books in the Caldwell household. But writing required secrecy and tools. She practiced with charcoal on with boards that could be wiped clean. She wrote letters with sticks and dirt. She traced words in ashes on hearthstones, training her hands to form letters with precision. By March 1845, she could write well enough to compose a letter. Step 2. Find an intermediary, someone with moral authority and no ties to the Ashland Circle. The opportunity arrived in late May. Reverend Thomas Redden, a circuit preacher from Nashville, came to Ashland Springs for a revival series. Redden was known for fiery sermons condemning corruption and for his connections among reformers, journalists, and anti-slavery advocates in the state capital. His presence unsettled the county elite. As was customary, he lodged with a wealthy family and spent 3 nights as a guest at the Caldwell estate. Marina took her chance. On Wednesday evening, while Redden ate supper with the family, she slipped into the guest room under pretext of cleaning. With a calmness that belied the risk, she placed a letter beneath the edge of his pillow, hidden but not so deeply that he wouldn't discover it before sleep. The letter was short and unsigned. Sir, a Christian man who speaks against corruption should know that great corruption exists in Ashland County, involving theft, court manipulation, and destruction of innocent lives. Detailed information is held by someone who has witnessed these acts and can recount them precisely. If you desire to hear more, walk past a large oak at the eastern boundary at dawn Thursday. Come alone. This concerns matters of justice that might interest a man of God. Reverend Redden found the letter that night. He opened it under the soft glow of a small candle. His expression, according to what he later told confidants, caught somewhere between alarm and curiosity. Anonymous letters could be traps. They could be tests of character. They could be attempts to create scandal or expose him to personal danger. But he was also a man genuinely troubled by the corruption he'd seen festering across Tennessee, and deeply committed to the idea that moral courage sometimes required stepping into darkness. He read the letter twice, then a third time. At dawn on Thursday, he walked the eastern boundary oak tree, moving with the casual air of a man taking an early stroll. Marina stepped forward from behind the trunk. Redden's face registered visible shock. Whatever he had expected, it was not a 21-year-old enslaved woman with one green eye and one hazel eye staring at him with a gravity that erased any notion of prank or mistake. "You wrote the letter," he said quietly. "Yes, sir," Marina replied. "I can read, I can write, and I can remember everything I've heard in this house for 15 years. Everything about 11 men who control this county through theft, fraud, and manipulation of the law. I know dates. I know names. I know amounts. I know every detail." Redden stared at her, stunned. "That is an extraordinary claim." "Test me," Marina said. She took a breath and began reciting. "Your sermon Tuesday night. You preached from Matthew chapter 7, about false prophets and diseased trees bearing diseased fruit. You opened with a thunderstorm in Nashville that destroyed a church steeple, and you used it as a metaphor for divine judgment. You quoted Matthew 7 verse 17 through 7:20. You gave 4 examples: merchants using false weights, lenders charging illegal rates, judges accepting bribes, and politicians selling public office. You ended with Micah 6 verse 8, and your sermon lasted 37 minutes. She paused. "Would you like me to continue with your exact phrasing?" Redden's face had drained of color. You couldn't possibly." "I can," Marina said simply. "I remember everything. Every voice. Every conspiracy. Every crime these men committed believing enslaved people could not understand them. I have heard them plan killings, coordinate foreclosures, steal land, and destroy families. And I can recount all of it with perfect accuracy." Then she said the words that changed everything. "I am being sold to Mississippi in 8 weeks. If that happens, everything I know disappears forever. But if someone can help me secure legal freedom, I will testify publicly. I can bring down an entire system." Reverend Redden stood silent for a long moment. Dawn was spreading across the tobacco field behind them. Golden light rising over land built on stolen labor and human suffering. "What you're proposing," he finally said, "is dangerous for you and for anyone who helps you." "I know," Marina replied. "But Clara Thomaston burned to death, so these men could steal her land. Caroline Mercer died poor in Nashville because they stole her inheritance. How many families have lost everything to fraudulent debts and rigged courts? Someone has to speak, and I can speak. I just need to live long enough to do it." Redden asked one more question, the most important one. "How do I know your memory is as perfect as you claim? Human memory fails. Trauma distorts things. Time changes details. Marina began speaking, and she recited his entire Tuesday sermon word for word. Every biblical passage, every metaphor, every anecdote, every inflection, every pause, all 37 minutes of it. Later, Redden said that hearing her was like listening to my own voice echo back at me from heaven or hell. When she finished, Redden stood silently for nearly a minute. "That is no ordinary gift," he whispered, shaken. "No, sir," Marina replied. "But what I've been forced to hear is no ordinary evil." Redden told her he needed time to pray, time to think. Marina told him she had 8 weeks before being chained and dragged south. He returned to the house in heavy contemplation. He preached that night about courage in confronting powerful wrongdoing, and he left Friday morning without indicating his decision. 5 days later, Marina received a message delivered through her mother. Lena, a free black man who occasionally worked on the estate, had slipped her a note. "The preacher believes you. Help is being arranged. Stay ready." Reverend Redden had gone to Nashville. He spoke softly but urgently to people he trusted, attorneys who had long sought evidence of organized corruption, abolitionists who funded freedom purchases, churchmen who opposed the grip plantation elites held on state politics, newspaper editors hungry for truth buried beneath Southern respectability. The response was immediate and coordinated. Money was raised quietly. Strategies were drawn up. Allies gathered. Protection plans formed. On July 5, 1845, just 2 days before Marina was scheduled to be handed to Trader William Hatcher, Nathan Caldwell, Jr. received an unexpected visitor. A Nashville attorney named Samuel Porter arrived at the plantation claiming to represent a religious benevolent society. He presented an offer, $1,200 for Marina's freedom, cash on the spot, manumission papers to be filed through Davidson County to avoid local entanglements. Purchasing enslaved individuals to free them, though controversial, was legal and not unheard of in Tennessee. Nathan Jr. saw only profit. The offer exceeded Hatcher's price by $250 and gave him immediate cash to soothe angry circle members. He negotiated only briefly, secured $1,300, and signed the manumission documents the same day. The paperwork was fully processed through the Nashville courts within a week. On July 12, 1845, Marina Caldwell became a free woman. She was placed under the guardianship of Mrs. Eleanor Crane, a widowed seamstress in Nashville known quietly for supporting anti-slavery causes. Mrs. Crane agreed to provide housing oversight and legal protection while attorneys prepared to act on Marina's information. By the time Nathan Caldwell Jr. understood what had happened, Marina was already out of Robertson County's reach. Secure in Nashville, surrounded by allies, and beginning to meet with lawyers who were initiating cases that would soon involve courts from Memphis to Knoxville, the realization struck the Ashland Circle like a lightning bolt in dry timber. Nathan Jr. called an emergency meeting on July 18th. All 11 members arrived at the Caldwell plantation that suffocating summer night. Mosquitoes thick outside, tension thicker inside. According to later statements from a servant who overheard fragments of the debate, the scene bordered on panic. They had lost control of their living archive. 20 years of carefully buried corruption could now be uncovered because Nathan Jr. had sold the one person who held everything in her perfect memory. Richard Callum demanded to know how Nathan Jr. could have been so catastrophically foolish. Jared Whitcomb suggested challenging the manumission papers on technicalities. Judge Redfield reminded them that she was now under the jurisdiction of Davidson County, where their influence was weak. Attorney Martin Kellier stated the truth plainly. She's legally free, protected, and she remembers everything. If she testifies, it is over. Someone suggested bribing her into silence. Another pointed out that she had chosen freedom and exposure over a lifetime of captivity. She would not be bought. Someone muttered about other methods. and the idea was immediately shouted down. Violence against a free black woman in Nashville, under protection of clergy, attorneys, and reformers, would bring precisely the attention they were desperate to avoid. They were trapped. The very system they had built, legal manipulation, coordinated influence, avoidance of records, was now their downfall. They had hidden so much that they had no legitimate documents to defend themselves with. They had corrupted Robertson County courts so thoroughly that their claims of innocence would be dismissed in any other jurisdiction. Nathan Jr. realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that desperation and arrogance had made him ruin them all. A servant later recalled that his face looked gray as river ash. Someone in the room finally asked a question that hovered like humidity. What do we do now? There was no answer, because there was no answer. For 20 years they had lived above consequence. Now consequence was coming, armed with perfect memory and legal protection. The Ashland Circle was already dead. They simply hadn't accepted it yet. What unfolded over the next 3 years became known in Tennessee law as the Ashland County Proceedings, though newspapers would later call it the Ashland Corruption Scandal. The cases involved multiple counties, multiple types of claims, and eventually drew attention from reformers as far away as Boston and New York. Abolitionist newspapers seized on the story as the embodiment of corruption thriving under slavery. The first case, September 1845. Marina's testimony began in Davidson County in a property restoration case brought by the surviving children of Clara Thomaston. For years, the Thomaston heirs had tried to challenge the seizure of their mother's land, but they were stonewalled by forged debts, manipulated filings, and judicial bias. Marina broke the wall. She testified that on August 14, 1830, she heard the circle plan to force Clara off her land. She repeated each man's exact words, strategies, motives, the step-by-step method for fabricating false debt claims. She detailed how Martin Kellier crafted the legal justification, how Judge Elias Redfield promised to validate it unquestioned, how Whitcomb had already named the acreage he intended to acquire. Defense attorneys erupted. An enslaved woman's testimony, even freed, should not be admissible. Memory from 15 years earlier could not be reliable. No white man should be condemned based on her claims. The judge disagreed. She was free at the time of her testimony. Davidson County had different precedents regarding admissibility. And then came the demonstration. Marina recited word for word the opening statements delivered 2 days earlier by both attorneys. Court stenographers compared her words to their notes. She had remembered everything perfectly. Where her testimony aligned with existing records, it was verified. Where missing documents created suspicious gaps, the pattern of loss itself supported her claims. The case lasted 3 weeks. In October, the court ruled the Thomaston property had been seized through fraud. The land was restored to Clara's heirs with damages. It was only the beginning. Through late 1845 and into 1846, more families came forward. Their attorneys were funded by anti-slavery groups, reformist clergy, and political rivals eager to dismantle plantation oligarchies. Marina testified in 11 separate cases, each time providing flawless recollections of private conversations, secret strategies, and orchestrated schemes. Whitcomb's land empire collapsed piece by piece as defrauded owners reclaimed their acreage. His few legitimate holdings, those he had actually purchased without corruption, were the assets that Jared Whitcomb still legally possessed. Those few properties he had acquired without fraud were sold off to cover judgments and staggering legal fees. By 1847, he had fled Tennessee entirely, resurfacing in Texas, where he died in 1852, penniless and disgraced. Grant Cumber, the banker, became the subject of formal criminal inquiry into banking fraud after Marina testified about his predatory loan structures. She detailed conversations in which Cumber openly explained how he designed repayment terms specifically to guarantee foreclosure, coordinating with other circle members to trap entire families in perpetual debt. The investigation lasted 8 months. Cumber was forced to resign from the bank in 1846, paid heavy civil fines, and escaped criminal conviction only through aggressive legal maneuvering. He died in Nashville in 1850, reputation ruined, name synonymous with corruption. Samuel Proctor's cotton gin business faced an avalanche of lawsuits. 37 farmers filed claims accusing him of cheating them with rigged scales and fabricated accounting. Marina's testimony was damning. She had heard Proctor, during circle meetings, brag about the very methods he used. Court-ordered audits confirmed massive discrepancies in his books. His business collapsed. By 1847, Proctor sold the gin for a fraction of what it once had been worth. Walter Hensley, the county land office supervisor, was removed from his post when Marina exposed his role in falsifying property documents and secretly providing privileged records to the circle. He was indicted for altering public records. His trial ended in a hung jury, but the damage was done. His career was over. He moved to Mississippi in 1848, leaving behind disgrace rather than legacy. One by one, through 1845, 1846, and into 1847, the 11 families faced legal repercussions, financial disasters, and a public humiliation they had never imagined possible. Some fought desperately, hiring new lawyers and using what remained of their political influence. Others fled the state entirely, abandoning mansions, farmlands, and reputations. And some, like Nathan Caldwell Jr., simply collapsed beneath the consequences of their own greed. The Caldwell plantation was foreclosed in 1846 after Nathan Jr. could no longer service the debts he had accumulated fighting the legal battles ignited by Marina's testimony. Creditors seized the estate, auctioning it piece by piece. Nathan Jr. vanished from Tennessee shortly after, last recorded in Arkansas Territory in 1849, working as a clerk in a frontier trading post. His inheritance, his authority, and his future were destroyed by his arrogance, by the single reckless decision to sell the woman who held the circle's secrets. The climactic trial, May 1847. The legal storm reached its peak in May 1847, during a massive consolidated criminal proceeding in Nashville addressing the most serious allegations: conspiracy to defraud, falsification of court documents, and bribery of public officials. The trial lasted nearly a month, drawing crowds from across Tennessee and even reporters from northern states. Marina testified for 6 consecutive days. She sat in the witness box, her distinctive mismatched eyes fixed on the jurors, and she unraveled 2 decades of carefully concealed corruption. She named dates, quoted sentences spoken years earlier, identified locations and participants. She explained how seemingly unrelated events were actually connected by coordinated schemes. Defense attorneys attacked relentlessly. They produced witnesses claiming Marina had misremembered small details. Yet when those details were checked against documentation, her version proved accurate more often than theirs. They argued her memory was impossibly perfect, but court officials had already tested her extensively, verifying her extraordinary recall abilities. They claimed her heterochromia indicated mental instability, summoning a physician from New York who speculated about neurological abnormalities. The prosecution countered with 3 experts who testified that eye color had no correlation with cognition or memory, and that Marina had been medically examined and deemed entirely sound. They accused her of being coached by abolitionists, but her details went back years before she had ever met anyone outside the Caldwell estate. Her testimony contained information no abolitionist could have known. The trial ended with mixed verdicts. On June 17, 1847, Judge Elias Redfield was convicted of judicial misconduct and permanently removed from the bench, though he avoided prison. Attorney Martin Kellier was disbarred and fined but escaped criminal conviction. Several circle members were convicted of lesser charges, small fines, brief jail terms. The justice system, even when forced to confront corruption, still protected its own where it could. But the real punishment occurred outside the courtroom. The Ashland Circle was annihilated, its members' fortunes shattered, their political influence disintegrated. Their names became synonymous with disgrace. Properties were sold, families scattered, reputations permanently blackened. Across Middle Tennessee, people whispered the same thing. A woman they once dismissed as property, a woman whose gift they exploited, whose humanity they denied, had destroyed 11 of the most powerful families in the region with nothing but the truth. Whispers of a curse filled the county. The woman with 2 different colored eyes had cursed them, ruined them, brought judgment through her very presence. But Marina Caldwell had never needed curses. She had needed only memory, courage, and the chance to speak aloud what others forced her to witness in silence. Aftermath. Marina Caldwell lived another 26 years after the trials. Her life from 1847 to 1873 remained largely. Her life after the trials became quiet, deliberately so. For 3 years, Marina had lived in the spotlight, testifying again and again, her face and story recognized across Tennessee and even beyond. What came afterward was a conscious retreat from visibility, a choice to return to the silence she had once been forced into, only now on her own terms. What we know from that period comes from fragments, scattered census entries, occasional newspaper mentions, legal filings from later property disputes, and bits of oral history passed down through families. Those stories often conflict with one another. Some exaggerate, some diminish. But one thing is certain, she never returned to Ashland County. The $50 she received from the Tennessee Anti-Slavery Society, the group that funded her manumission, combined with small gifts from families who had reclaimed their land through her testimony, allowed her to build a modest but stable life within Nashville's free Black community. She married in September 1849 to David Porter, a skilled carpenter who had purchased his own freedom in 1843. Their marriage is recorded in Davidson County archives. They had 3 children who lived into adulthood. Sarah, born 1850, who became a teacher. Thomas, born 1852, who followed his father into carpentry. Eleanor, born 1855, who married a local shopkeeper and lived until 1921. Census records from 1850, 1860, and 1870 list Marina as a laundress, a demanding but independent occupation common for free Black women in Nashville. The work allowed her to avoid white households where her distinctive eyes and story might reveal her identity. Yet hints remain in court records, small references to an unnamed woman with precise knowledge of long-ago property disputes. In several legal cases from the 1850s, a witness described in transcripts only as a woman with eyes of different colors provided detailed information that helped resolve complicated claims. It appears her remarkable memory continued to serve justice, quietly, without recognition. She still spoke, but only when needed, and when her words were no longer required. She returned to her private life, guarding her silence. The aftermath of the 11 families. The families of the Ashland Circle scattered across the South and Midwest, their influence broken. Richard Callum's grandson changed the family name to Kilbourne and moved to Kentucky in 1869. Senator Reed Ashford's children settled in Alabama. Thomas Wells's sons sold their mercantile business in 1851 and relocated to St. Louis. Abner Trask, who once ran the slave market, died in 1849, impoverished and forgotten. Henry Lohman sold his tobacco warehouse in 1848 and moved to New Orleans, where he died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1853. Robertson County itself changed as the old network collapsed. New settlers bought properties once controlled by the Circle. Political alliances reshaped. It wasn't justice. Far from it. The system that allowed such corruption to flourish still stood. It would take a civil war to begin dismantling it, but that particular web of coordinated wrongdoing never reformed. Its members had become a warning, a cautionary tale whispered across Middle Tennessee. Then came the courthouse fire of 1891. It began around 2 a.m. on March 7th in the room where the oldest records were stored. By the time Springfield's volunteer brigade arrived, the entire West Wing was a furnace. The blaze burned for nearly 3 hours. Hundreds of documents from the 1840s vanished forever. The official cause was listed as undetermined, possibly accidental. No arrests, no suspects. Some historians claim it was simply an unfortunate fire in an aging building. Others note that the records destroyed included detailed transcripts and depositions filled with unflattering truths about several families whose descendants still held local influence in 1891. What survived were fragments, old newspaper clippings, stray documents filed in other counties, family stories shaped by memory, guilt, or pride. Local historians still debate what truly happened. Some insist Marina exaggerated, that her memories were flawed, or that political enemies of the old families manipulated her for their own agendas. Others point to the undeniable pattern. 11 powerful families collapsed simultaneously, and courts found her testimony overwhelmingly credible in an era when the legal system strongly favored white male property owners. The simplest explanation remains the most convincing. Marina Caldwell told the truth. She left no memoir. No written account of her life exists. Whether by choice or necessity, we cannot say. Perhaps she wanted to protect her family. Perhaps she wanted peace after years of tension and danger. Or perhaps she believed her testimony, spoken aloud in 1845 to 47, was all the record she ever needed. She died in Nashville on August 14, 1873, at age 49. Her death certificate still sits in Davidson County archives. Cause of death: pneumonia. She was buried in the colored section of the Old City Cemetery, marked by a simple wooden cross. Over the decades, the cemetery expanded, buildings rose, markers rotted, and by the 1920s the exact location of her grave was no longer identifiable. There is no monument bearing her name, no plaque standing in Robertson County. The plantation where she spent her first 21 years was divided and sold long ago, its buildings razed, its land turned into neighborhoods. But in the unrecorded corners of Middle Tennessee history, in the spaces between the official narratives, her story still survives. 12 families undone. A young woman with mismatched eyes who saw everything and forgot nothing. Not a curse, but consequence. Not magic, but memory. Not vengeance, but truth. A truth powerful enough to bring down men who believed they could speak freely before someone they refused to see as human. In the end, their downfall came not from war, nor rebellion, nor divine wrath. It came from a single voice, finally allowed to speak. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything happened exactly as described? Or do you think Middle Tennessee still hides secrets buried deeper than the ashes of a courthouse fire? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this dark chapter of American history intrigued you, and you want to hear more stories like it, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. Until the next story, remember, the past is never forgotten as the powerful want it to be. And sometimes justice arrives not through armies or laws, but through a single person finally given a chance to speak the truth.